This is Rock Hall 7, and you're watching a history of cultural impacts. Hey, what's happening? Do you know what the 80s were like? Maybe I don't know myself, but I do know a few top details. The 80s is sometimes referred to as the modern Renaissance period, the era Ronald Reagan was president and made big differences during this time. A time when club music shifted from the disco era into a more house and soon industrial and electronica style. A time when gender roles were challenged massively through a new trend called glam. The most hardcore rock genres got a spotlight in this decade. Even hardcore punk rock was invented in this decade. This decade was symbolized by a Rubik's Cube, also sounded by new wave of rock and roll. My, pop music was at its peak in this decade with a famous performer, Madonna. Yeah, there were some pretty ridiculous fashions and trends in this time, but most of the experimentation with rock and roll happened in this decade. Cinderella was the grace of glam in this decade, though he was famous in the 70s. Mike Score was a trendsetter for the decade, which is oddly true. It is also a decade Metallica gave heavy metal a serious facelift in sound and muscle. Michael Jackson became another huge pop culture icon with the moonwalk and Thriller dance. Prince was famous for having various personalities and sounds. His equal Rick James became famous as well. Punk rock's famous Billy Idol became a big name in the 80s that made punk rock a huge part of pop culture. Pop metal became a genre in this decade, soon to be joined by other pop genres in areas such as punk and goth in later decades. Rap music was also famed in this decade as various other genres popped up and became known. Even parody artist Weird Al Yankovic became a huge hit for laughs in the 80s to make light of a ridiculous decade in pop culture. Of course, this was also the decade known for kids in school creating what's now called the in crowd, and they were labeled preps. Also, the first CD players came in this decade, breaking away from record players and boom boxes. The music Being the mainstream media was the main philosophy of television in the 80s, shows were not so interesting. Movies were only so good, but gaming still did well. The Cosby Show was one of the many sitcoms that gave a return to family sitcoms. Oprah got her own show, which eventually made her more powerful than the president. She allowed people of weird sexual preferences to be featured and part of mainstream culture. Miami Vice expanded cop shows' popularity on television, adding MTV-style music videos. MTV became a TV station dedicated to all-day and night music videos, replacing previous video stations that introduced the mainstream back in the 70s. Punky Brewster became a TV hit for teens all across the nation, being it featured many of the trends and fads they were into. The 70s was an intro to soap operas, but the 80s made them popular for women at the time, with the huge hit General Hospital. Also introduced as an alternative to vampires was the show Highlander, introducing a new mortal being. Much Music, a now existent station, was an alternative to MTV, which moreover featured videos but also introduced fads and trends to teens. Eventually MTV would be the introducee to that. Star Trek continued as the popular science fiction of our time through Next Generation. Murder, She Wrote became another huge hit TV amongst young adults and mature audiences. Comedy Central was established and had a first hit with Mystery Science Theater 3000. Many talk shows such as Tracy Ullman's Show, predating the Late Night Show and other talk shows, made big for the next decade. VHS, JVC tapes, and CDs were introduced soon to be a huge importance in later decades. Crime films came back big, with Scarface as the biggest hit since The Godfather. Sci-fi films such as Star Wars continued to be a huge part of pop culture, even the film about a friendly alien in a movie called E.T., the Extraterrestrial. Other major sci-fi hits such as Blade Runner, Tron, The Terminator, and Aliens opened up new windows to sci-fi. Predator and The Abyss became especially important, for they were pioneers to CGI filmmaking. Star Trek films continued popular sci-fi hits, with 2 sequels giving a long-lasting sensation for science fiction. Action films began to expand in this decade, becoming more relevant in the cinema aspects such as Indiana Jones, a huge adventure phenomenon, Rambo, a major shoot-'em-up Vietnam action film, RoboCop, Die Hard, the peak of all action films, Lethal Weapon, Escape from New York, Commando, Top Gun, Ghostbusters, a paranormal ghost action film, and Back to the Future, an unforgettable cult classic. Actors such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, now the Governor of California, Harrison Ford, Tom Cruise, Mel Gibson, Sylvester Stallone, and Chuck Norris, the kick-ass cowboy, were all important actors for action films. Horror were given a rise at this time with films such as Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Hellraiser, Poltergeist, Evil Dead, The Lost Boys, The Fly, The Shining, hugely relevant to later paranormal ghost stories, The Thing, My Bloody Valentine, Mortuary, Phantasm, The Hills Have Eyes, and Fatal Attraction. As for film animation, Disney has a huge renaissance, with The Little Mermaid providing a huge beginning to the animation world. Teen films began appearing at this time. The most relevant ones are The Breakfast Club, St. Elmo's Fire, and Pretty in Pink. Other major films that became huge were Dune, Jim Henson's The Labyrinth, The Never-Ending Story, and Karate Kid. Gaming was rather simple, but still eventually had a partial breakout in pop culture with Nintendo's Mario.